My sister and I were reminiscing on our favourite childhood memories when I decided to tell her about the creatures I used to think I saw behind our old house. She told me she saw the exact same things. Both of our stories lined up so perfectly that it actually freaked us out, and we had to stop talking about it. Several years ago, we were in northwestern Oregon. We've since moved states. We lived in St. Helens, in a house with a huge wooded area behind it. We always played and explored back there. When I was back there, sometimes I would see movement in the corner of my vision. Whenever I would look over to see what it was, I would see one of these things. I never really saw them at the same time. The first one was tall, dark, and super lanky. It walked on all fours and just looked sickly. When I turned to look at it, it would freeze in place, then just bolt further into the forest. It looked leathery, with only a little bit of hair on its legs and neck. It always looked like it had a big ears or antlers, but I could never tell for sure. I never saw its face. When it stood still, it had a solid shape. Whenever it bolted, it was like it lost its shape and the edges of it were constantly shifting. The second one scared me even more. It had the same lanky legs and walked on all fours, but the body was disproportionately larger than the legs. It also looked like it had more hair than the other one. I would always see it just before or after the first one I described. It also had the same weird ears or antlers, but it was always standing somewhere dark. Unlike the first one, which always seemed to not mind light as long as there was lots of trees. I never saw it move. It would just stand there when I saw it and disappear when I blinked or looked away. I also saw this one's face, and it had these huge milky white eyes with no pupils. Sometimes I would catch it watching me from behind or between trees. They both were about the size of a large horse or something. We could also hear branches snap whenever the smaller one bolted. The first few times I saw them, I was scared shitless. Before I saw the first one, I'd always just felt a little anxious and like I was being watched. Before I saw the second one, I'd felt the same way, but would also get a strong sense of dread to go along with it. After a while, as child me got more accustomed to seeing them, I'd whisper greetings to them. They'd stick around a few seconds longer than usual whenever I did, like they could hear my whispers. Eventually, I felt more comfortable with them being there. I didn't feel the dread or fear after a few years of seeing them. Something told me not to try and get close, but as long as I respected our distance, I almost felt safer knowing they were there. I even saw the large one, because of its eyes, in the forest outside my bedroom window one night when it was raining. I told my sister all of this, and she started freaking out, saying she thought they were like weird imaginary friends. If I had to describe something that vaguely resembles them, I'd say like a cross between a deer, a bear, a large one, and a sickly wolf, a small one, and a man. Like a Wendigo almost, but not quite the same. It never seemed evil either, just scared me at first. They might have been some fucked up animals, but that doesn't feel right to me for some reason. Back in January 2022, I wanted to go on a self-healing trip due to the passing of my best friend a year prior. I have this habit of looking for untouched raw places in Google Maps using satellite view. I usually just look at it for hours, zooming in on places I think are difficult to reach, and start Googling for information about that place. And I found an island, a beautiful white sandy beach island. At least that's what it looked like from satellite view. I'll not disclose this island's name because I want to keep it a secret from tourists in hope that it won't be exploited into a tourist island so I can return one day to enjoy its beauty once again. I had several more options, but I fell in love with this one just from the satellite image. I'm a dive master who has lived several years on several beautiful islands, so I can at least tell you that this island is perfect. It's a small island, approximately 0.83 kilometers squared, no high terrain, and it's protected by some sort of wave breakers and sandbanks, just about 300 meters from the shore, making the beach safe from big waves. I was told by the locals on a nearby island that the wave breakers are new islands. I think it was formed by underwater eruptions. Anyway, I didn't find any information about the island except for one 4-year-old article, which only talked about a local professor who made a day trip to said island and said it's a beautiful island. That's it. So I started my plan to go to this island. I needed to go to the closest civilization to that island. What I needed was a flight, a 6-hour bus ride, a 12-hour ferry ride, and about 24 hours of waiting around to reach the nearby town. Or a village, because it didn't look like a town. Even getting the information about the transportation to get to that village was a headache. Several phone calls and asking the locals around. I packed my stuff, including camping gear and survival kits, and went on my journey. I reached the village, let's call it Port Village, at almost midnight. With my heavy backpacks, I walked a kilometre from the port to the village. There was no public transportation, sadly. I was very tired from the journey, so I asked around for lodging, but there were none. Yep, they don't have hotels, B&B, or lodgings, and they were quite suspicious at this man who was walking around at midnight with heavy gear. They're very wary of visitors, as they don't really have many of us. I planned to set up my camp on a field nearby, so I asked one family, thank God they were still awake, for permission, because I didn't want to alarm anyone that would see my camp in the morning. The nice family instead offered me a room to sleep for the night, free of charge. They even fed me breakfast. The next morning, I spoke to the family about my intention to go to this remote island. They didn't know much about it, and I asked if they knew any boat that I could hire to take me there. So they took me to another family. I spoke to an old lady from another family, and she said she has a cousin who has a small fishing boat, but he lives on another island. Let's call it Fish Village. So she called her cousin, the boat captain, to pick me up from the port village at noon. I thanked the lady and paid for the boat rent and gave a little bit more of her time. While waiting, I went to buy some supplies and fill up my water jug. When I returned to this old lady's house, she offered me a cup of coffee and some snacks. We sat there and had a conversation. Some particular questions she kept repeating to me were, are you sure you want to go to that island? And are you not afraid to be alone on that island? The boat captain also asked those questions to that lady over the phone. I told her that I'm used to travelling alone to uninhabited places, even in tribal areas. She didn't look so sure and had this guy is nuts look. At noon, the boat captain picked me up from the old lady's place. He told me it took about 15 minutes from his village to get to Port Village by boat. I asked how long it takes to get to the remote island. He said it takes about an hour. While walking to the port, he explained to me that it wasn't a good season to go out to the sea, and that the waves are big and often stormy. I asked if it was safe, because if not, I had to stay a month in that village to wait out for the rainy season to end. He said it's okay. He told me that some fishermen usually live on that island to fish in the fishing season for a few months, then move out once the rainy season starts. So right now, the island was empty. He explained to me where the freshwater well is located, and which part of the island I can go to get phone coverage. To my surprise, it actually caught 4G signal in a particular spot, although weak. He warned me, and sort of emphasised on it, not to go to the centre of the island or into the forest. He said, you'd get lost and never come out. Stay on the shoreline. He also told me not to swim the sandbank. Understanding that villagers tend to be superstitious, I shrugged it off. At the port, I saw the small boat, about 5 metres long and 1.5 meters wide. It was scary, considering the dark cloud was looming over where we were heading. About 15 minutes ride, the waves were starting to go crazy. I was scared and excited at the same time. 30 minutes, it wasn't exciting anymore. The boat was experiencing a problem because the waves were big. The engine was flooded. Later, the captain told me he forgot to close some lids or something. The captain asked me to take the helm, change course and navigate the boat through the waves towards his village, while he fixed the engine and took out the water that came in the boat. He asked me if it's okay to go to the island tomorrow and just stay overnight at his village. I said that's fine. I just wanted to survive that day. It's a good thing that I'm a dive master who's been on many boats for years, so I sort of know how to navigate through a choppy sea. He asked me if I could swim. That question terrified me. About 10 minutes we dealt with that disaster, and finally the problem was fixed. He took back the helm and changed the course again toward the remote island. We rode the angry sea with me humming the Pirate of the Caribbean theme and sang Paradise by Coldplay because of Life of Pi. When we finally made it to the island, I had mixed feelings. I was relieved that we survived the storm, and I was in awe of the beauty of the island, but at the same time I felt loneliness and sadness. like I was looking at a beautiful island from the memory of my past. I boarded off with my gear, and to my surprise, the captain said he'll go home and will call me later that day. He asked me when I wanted to be picked up. I said I'd call him and let him know. Before we said goodbye, he warned me again not to go into the forest. I nodded, while thinking, it's a small island. Nobody can get lost in it. I turned around and realised that he dropped me off at the abandoned fisherman's settlement. There were around 6 to 8 small elevated huts made from woods and coconut fronds and leaflets. I picked up my gear from the beach and walked towards one of the huts and set my gear on the stairs. I looked around a bit to find a good camping spot. I looked curiously at the forest behind the settlement. It certainly gave off a strange feeling, and somehow it sent chills down my spine. I got rid of the negative thoughts and found a good camping spot. I picked up my tent and started to set it up. While setting up the tent, I heard rustling noises from the forest. At first, I thought it came from some curious small animals, until it made a weird sound that I've never heard from an animal before. I thought maybe it was some kind of big flightless bird. The sound it was making felt like it came from a bird species because of how unique the noise was, like a mixed ostrich mating call with wild boar noise. But I know for a fact that ostriches don't exist in that area, and wild boars tend to avoid heavy forests. I could be wrong about the boars. The noises distracted me a couple times and I became alarmed. I tried to ignore it and finished up building my tent. It was around 4 p.m. when I looked for twigs and branches for a bonfire around the camp. The feeling of being watched was still lingering, but I tried my best to ignore it. Once I collected enough, I made a small bonfire and cooked a meal for dinner. I sat on a log at the beach in front of my camp, with headphones wrapped around my ears. The storm had passed a few hours ago. I sat there while listening to Saturn by Sleeping at Last, and enjoying the sunset and a bowl of soup in my hand. After a wonderful sunset, the bonfire seemed to die off too, and it started to rain a bit. Tired from a long journey, I wanted to restore my energy as soon as possible, to prepare for an exploration the next day. I left the embers of the bonfire and went into my tent. I turned on the light and read an e-book for a short moment to help me sleep. It was getting dark outside, and the atmosphere changed. Suddenly, the entire hair on my skin stood straight. It was so intense I couldn't ignore it. So I tried to keep my mind busy with some movies I downloaded on my phone. My thoughts went crazy. I started to see unpleasant images. I tried so hard to think about something else, pleasant things, good memories. I tried to chase the bad thoughts away, but it persisted. I started to see scary things in my head, images that at the time seemed so real, yet I can't remember what they were now. Meanwhile, the chills were so intense, I shivered, even in that hot, humid evening. So I put a pair of earphones in my ears and played the storm noise that I sometimes used to help me sleep. I closed my eyes tightly and tried to sleep through all the strange sensations I was experiencing at that moment. My feet were touching the fabric of the tent when my right foot was shoved from the outside. I was startled and drew my feet away from the edge and moved my sleeping position a bit to the centre of the tent. I thought maybe it was the water jug falling off because I put the jug exactly on the other side of where my right foot was. On the other side was the small porch of my tent, which means it was inaccessible from outside, as I closed the porch's cover as well. I'll check in the morning, I thought. I was finally able to sleep an hour later. When I woke up in the morning, the first thing I did was to check if my water jug indeed fell off. It didn't. It stayed there standing on the other side of the tent where my feet were last night. It got me curious on what might have shut me that night. A monitor lizard, which is common there, couldn't possibly do that because they're too big to slip into my tent's porch through the bottom slit without disturbances I would notice. So that remains a mystery until today. The morning was sunny and nice. The eerie atmosphere wasn't as strong as the other day, and the island looked amazingly beautiful and pristine. I decided to take a morning swim before exploring the island. My original plan was to set up camp there temporarily when I arrived, and move to the northern part the next day, because according to the satellite image, the northern part was promising views and a nice bay, although lacking fresh water source. After a swim and breakfast, I packed my small dry bag with a survival kit, and walked along the beach in the western part of the island, towards the north. I was excited to see many short coconut trees. I made a mental note to grab some coconuts on my way back to the temporary camp. While trailing the beach, I couldn't help but glance at the forest every few seconds. The forest was very thick, with various tropical vegetation. It's surprisingly quiet. No birds singing, no rustling noises made by rodents. All I heard was the gentle sound of small waves hitting the soft, white sandy beach. It was peaceful, yet haunting. Most of the northern part was covered with pine trees. I stood on a small cape and scoured the area. It's where I got phone coverage and a weak 4G signal. My friends' messages started coming in, and I checked on them and sent them pictures and videos that I made to the island. I then went to the bay and explored the area. I went into the pine forest and found a nice camping spot. The forest's atmosphere wasn't as heavy as the west part of the island, though I was still feeling cautious because of my experience the previous day. I stood still and looked around, trying to hear or see if anything was lurking in the shadows of the trees, but found nothing. I checked a satellite image of the island on my phone and found that there was some kind of marsh just a little bit to the east of the pine trees. I wasn't sure if I wanted to move to the north, very close to the marsh, and far from the fresh water source, but I didn't want to go through yesterday's terrible experience anymore. I'll decide later, I told myself. After I'd seen enough of the northern part, I returned to my camp, and I made a stop to take some of the coconuts on the way back. Back at the camp, the strange atmosphere returned, and it started to affect my mental state. I hadn't recovered from the grief of losing my friend. Even worse, the memory of me discovering her lifeless body, covered in her own blood like a scene from a gory movie, still haunts me. Sometimes it just came rushing back to my mind whenever I stopped doing any activities. Somehow, this island intensifies that terrible memory. I didn't like staying too long at the camp, so I took my mask and snorkel, made a hunting spear, and went into the sea and hunted for fish. After about half an hour, I returned to the beach without any fish and decided to go north again. In the north, I dived into the bay, and all of a sudden, a strong current dragged me towards the sandbank. I tried to fight the current and swam up the slope. I noticed that the current was heading towards this dark underwater canyon between the island and the sandbank. If I had my scuba diving gear, I'd be happy to explore that canyon. Exhausted, I walked out of the bay and sat in the shade of pine trees, watching a fisherman's boat passing by in the distance. Out of nowhere, I started to cry. I wasn't sure why. A few moments passed and I stopped crying. I picked up my things and headed back to camp, worried that the high tide would close my way back and I had to go into the forest to get back. On my way back, I saw a man near my camp taking pictures of me with his phone. I walked up to him and he smiled and greeted me. I was confused as to why there's another person on the island as it's supposed to be empty. He said he wanted to talk. I asked what about, and he just said, let's talk back at my camp. Upon reaching my camp, I saw 4 other people, including the boat captain from yesterday. This drew my curiosity and worries. Were they trying to rob me, or am I in trouble? I asked what's going on, and the first man introduced himself as the chief of Fish Village. He introduced the others, but I didn't bother to remember their names because I was anxious at the current situation. He started explaining that he was to investigate me on behalf of the sub-district head about my intention for my visit to the island. Apparently, my arrival to the sub-district and my visit to the island had been a hot topic in the whole area. I became quite famous overnight. A rumour said I was in possession of a bomb to do coral bombing. Another rumour said I was a treasure hunter who came to the island to seek its hidden treasure. And the last rumour said I was a serial killer hiding from authorities. The rumours were so ridiculous that I wanted to laugh, but I held back because I didn't want to offend the gentleman in front of me. I simply told them that I was doing research and was going to write a book about the island. The chief asked me for my ID and I showed him. He asked me nicely to come with him to the fish village. According to him, the sub-district head and the police wanted him to take me to the sub-district office, but he tried to calm them down and told them that he'd interrogate me, instead in the fish village. It's getting dark, so I packed all my stuff in my tent. I saw the gentlemen were getting uneasy, so I sped up my pace and followed them to the boat. We arrived at Fish Village in the evening, and we went straight to the chief's house. Before we started with the interview, I asked him if there's a little shop nearby that sells a can of cold soft drink. As being on the island with only coffee and fresh water, I was dying to take a sip on any flavoured drinks, especially soft drinks. He told me the shop is just down the road, so I headed out to find out. The main road of the village is just a small paved pathway. They often don't have electricity at night, so I walked in the dark. They seem to be used to walking in the dark without any lights. I found the little shop and bought a can of Sprite. It wasn't cold, but my first sip quickly turned into a big gulp. I finished the can in one go. When I returned to the chief's house, he was already alone and ready to interview me. He asked me about my intention to visit the island again and how long I planned to be there. He said that I was supposed to report to the sub-district office about it. They were concerned about my safety, so I asked him why. He was hesitant at first to answer my question. Then he revealed that the island is the most haunted place in the area. I just nodded in amusement, because I don't believe in such things. He also said that some locals got lost in the woods. I asked what happened to them, and he didn't answer. He only said that they, the locals, don't go into the woods. In fact, they wouldn't dare go into the island alone. He told me a story about one of the fishermen who lived there during the dry season. He went out to get some water from the well when he noticed one of his neighbours was sitting on the stairs outside his own hut, so he came up to him for a small talk. They talked a bit, and then the fisherman moved on to get his water. The next day, he returned to the fish village and found out that the neighbour he talked to last night passed away just a few days ago. While I like stories like that for entertainment, I still find it hard to believe. All my life, I've only seen this kind of thing once, and I wasn't even sure what that was, because I didn't have time to react to it except for a startled scream before it was gone. I remember I was doing some laundry in the back of the second floor of my house. It was like half open space with iron bars covering the openings, so no living being bigger than a rat would be able to sneak into the house. It was at midnight. Yeah, an odd time to do laundry. That was kind of my habit. I was talking to my ex-boyfriend while taking my clothes out of the dryer, when suddenly, in the corner of my eyes, I saw a shadow moving fast out of my house. I turned my head towards the door, and there it was. A 2-meter tall shadow stood there, staring at me, with its bloodshot eyes. I was shocked, and let out a spontaneous scream. My ex, who was talking to me, turned around to see what I was screaming at, but the shadow moved and flew out through the window bars, so quickly that my ex didn't see it. Maybe it was just my imagination or my mind playing tricks on me. Who knows? If only I could draw my camera as quickly as it showed itself. So I always find people who believe in ghost sighting videos on the internet ridiculous. Like, how are those cameras just conveniently recording or capturing the sightings with a perfect angle? These things, if they were real, would show up when we least expect it. At least that's what I think. After we were done with the interview, the chief told me how the sub-district head was calling him the other night, asking if there were any fishermen on the island, because he saw a bonfire at night. And since the island is pretty far from the port village, the fire must be quite big to be seen from that distance. I was confused and told the chief that there was no bonfire at night. The fire I made was small, just big enough for cooking, and it died out just before dark. It was probably from my tent, so I didn't think much of it and asked if I could return to the island the next morning. The chief wasn't sure. He stopped and thought for a bit, and finally said I could return to the island only if I check in on them every day. I agreed to it. He then said that I'm the bravest, if not craziest outsider he ever met, and that I'm the first one that ever stepped foot on the island. The next day, the chief and the boat captain took me back to the island. This time, I asked them to drop me off at the North Bay. We talked a bit on the way. The chief still wasn't sure about taking me back there, but I assured him that I'm not scared and that I'm used to dealing with paranormal things. I didn't tell him I'm not a believer, because it might offend them, as they're a very traditional group of people. When we arrived at the bay, 2 men helped me carry my stuff. I told them to drop it at the beach, but they insisted on carrying it to where I planned to camp. I was pretty sure they just wanted to know where I would camp. I led them to the pine trees through some knee-high bushes. At the camping spot, they put down my things and observed the place. I assured the chief that I'll call him once a day, and if I don't, they should wait one more day before checking on me, because my battery might run out, and it kind of takes a whole day to charge my portable battery using solar panels. They wanted to help me set up my camp, but I told them that it's okay for them to leave. After they left, I built my tent and put most of my things inside. It was a cloudy, humid day, so I decided to take a quick swim and try my luck with spearfishing. The fish in the bay were pretty small, and I sucked at spearfishing, so I ended up just observing the coral reef. I got startled by a sudden quick yank at my left ankle. I looked back in panic at my feet, and there was nothing there. For a moment, I thought it was a titan triggerfish, as they could be pretty aggressive during mating season. But that wasn't their ugly human-like teeth. That felt like a hand. Feeling afraid, I swam back to the shore and observed the bay, just in case there was another person in it. After a few minutes, nothing. I tried to rationalize it and told myself that I was just imagining things, as my mental state wasn't reliable due to my ongoing grief and trauma. I went back to my camp and dried myself. I took my hammock and set it up between two pine trees just next to my tent and lay on it with a book in my hand. I fell asleep not too long after and woke up at noon. My stomach was rumbling, asking for lunch, so I dragged myself out of the hammock and started gathering twigs for firewoods. There was the sound of a snapped twig. I ignored it. Then another one. I still ignored it. Then another one. It was hard to ignore the third time, so I looked around trying to pinpoint which direction it came from, but the sound disappeared as quickly as it came. I stood silent for a few seconds, focusing on my hearing, but nothing, just the sound of waves in the distance. So I continued gathering firewood while mumbling to "You don't exist" a few times. A twig snapped one more time, and I too snapped. I yelled, "Oh, for fuck's sake, leave me alone, will ya?" At the point I was more annoyed than scared. The twig snap noises stopped. I continued on making a fire to cook for my lunch. Nothing much happened the whole day, as I was being lazy and didn't do much aside from reading a book and did a little jog along the bay. In late afternoon, I went to the west part to enjoy the sunset. At this time, the tide usually was high, and it would take a swim over the mangroves or cutting through the woods to get to the abandoned settlement, and it takes about 10 or 15 minutes to walk from the northern part. I was disappointed to find that it was too cloudy to see the sunsets, so I walked back to camp to prepare for dinner instead. It was starting to rain around 6 p.m, just when I started the fire. I let the rain put out the fire. Meanwhile, I washed myself from the saltwater residues with the rain before getting into my tent. I had to settle with hard protein bars for dinner instead. The rain was pretty heavy and I loved it. It was a nice ambience for sleeping. I pulled out my sleeping bag and prepared it, and I started to feel that chill feeling I felt on my first night. It wasn't as intense, but it still alarmed me, and I expected the horrible thoughts to come flooding in my head. But they didn't. Instead, I heard whispers among the sound of the rain, or I thought I heard them. It creeped me out, so I panicked, grabbed my headphones and started some random music from its playlist just to drown out those whispers. I got in my sleeping bag and put on my headphone and closed my eyes, trying to shut out all the negative thoughts. I woke up probably a few hours later, not sure what time it was, but it was still dark. My headphone's battery died and so did my LED light. The rain had stopped. So I listened intently to any strange noises, but nothing, so I went back to sleep. I woke up again quite early in the morning. I wasn't sure why I still insisted on staying on the island. Most people would probably already leave after the first night. To be honest, I was scared, but I also loved the thrill of it. I always welcome unique or thrilling events that unfold during my trips, so I have stories to tell, no matter how bizarre they are. Like how I found out that one of my exes was actually a sociopath during our getaway to a private island. It was terrifying, yet thrilling. Ever since I was a kid, I've always experienced a suspenseful life, like how I went to school escorted and guarded by military personnel during a civil uprising. How my childhood neighbourhood was experiencing a paranormal possession for a whole month because of what my friends and I did. Anyway, back to the island. The morning was also uneventful, so I decided to go to the settlement to clean myself at the well and maybe find some buckets to collect rainwater, so I don't have to go back and forth to the settlement or make a saltwater desalination. The island was quiet and peaceful as usual. I saw some fishermen's boats in the distance while I was heading towards the settlement. At the settlement, that feeling of being watched returned. I took a quick bath and then looked for water containers. After about 15 minutes, I finally found 2 containers. Just before I left the settlement, I heard it again. That rustling in the woods, followed by strange noise. I hastily tied the containers to my dry bag and left. On my way back, I still sensed that I was being watched and more. I got a feeling that something was following me. I looked back every few steps, but nothing was there. Maybe it was just my imagination, but it felt very real. I continued on until I reached the cape in the North Part, where I no longer felt that presence. I turned and observed where it came from. Nothing. I waited another 5 minutes. Still nothing. So I turned and headed towards the bay. That's when I caught something moving in the corner of my eye. I turned my head towards where I caught that movement. It was in the woods along the west coast. I didn't quite catch what it was, only a silhouette of black, moving thing. A shadow or something else, I'm not sure. Now I got goosebumps. I quickly ran to my camp. I looked for my phone and headed back to the cape where I could make a phone call. I called the boat captain a few times, but it didn't get through. Maybe he was out fishing. So I tried calling the chief. He picked it up on the first try. I calmly talked to him and told him I'm doing okay. I didn't want to sound panicked or scared and embarrassed myself after what I said to him the last time. I asked him if he could arrange my pickup in the afternoon. He said it wouldn't be possible because it looked like the storm was coming. He asked me if the next morning was okay. I went silent for a few moments and then said it's okay. We talked a bit more and then I said see you and hung up the phone. I went back to my camp and didn't even bother to cook lunch. I stayed in my tent the rest of the day. It was also raining, so I only ate a few protein bars and snacks. I didn't feel like leaving my tent. It was my safe space. I put on my earphones and watched some movies on my phone until it got dark outside. I put my phone on charge and turned on my LED lights. It was still raining and heavy too. That's good. That means I didn't have to hear any strange noises outside. I was wrong. I heard it again. Whispers. I couldn't make out what they were saying. First because of the rain, and second, I didn't want to listen to it. Since my phone was on charge and I forgot to charge my wireless headphone, I had nothing to distract me from those whispers. My nape hairs stood up and I got goosebumps. To distract me from these creepy situations, I started to sing Mr. Blue Sky and YMCA. Weird choice, but they kind of make me feel happier. I kept on singing them on repeat until I fell asleep. I was woken up by a pat on my right shoulder. I'm still not sure if this was a dream or if it actually happened. I opened my eyes and looked around in my tent half asleep and saw nothing. I mumbled something. I didn't know what I said and I went back to sleep. The morning came and the rain had completely stopped. I brought my phone to the cape and called him, asking him what time he'd pick me up. He said in 2 hours. That gave me enough time to pack up my things, and that's what I did after. The chief came half an hour late, but I was relieved to get picked up. I greeted him, and the boat captain and both helped me load my stuff on the boat. I didn't tell them about the strange things that had been happening on the island. He told me that the ferry won't be there till Thursday, so I could stay in his house for a few days. When we left the fish village and I stayed at the chief's home, nothing much interesting happened after that, except for one of the nights, when I saw what must have been a lightning strike in the sea. So close that I thought the generator exploded. The island, which is translated as many mosquitoes from the local language, is still one of the most beautiful islands I've ever been to. And I've been to many beautiful islands, and also the strangest I've experienced in my life. I'd love to return to the island, but with some friends. I still refuse to believe in paranormal things outside the realm of entertainment, because if I don't believe it, it can't hurt me. I don't remember how old I was when I had this experience. All I can remember that this was my first encounter with a strange or maybe paranormal occurrence. My parents used to take me to this beach every other Sunday. The beach used to be very nice, and sometimes full of families. But ever since they built a market next to the beach, not many people or even want to go to the beach anymore. It was one Sunday morning when I begged my parents to take me to that beach again, because it had been a while and I hadn't gone there. My mum didn't want to go, so she asked my dad to take me by himself. So we went to the beach, which was an hour away from our home. The weather was perfect that day. When we arrived in the area, my dad parked the car at the new market's parking lot, and I hopped off the car happily. I ran straight to the beach and jumped in the water, while my dad sat on the stone steps at one end of the beach and watched me. There was nobody else at the beach, only my dad and I. I found it odd, because there used to be a lot of people here on Sundays, but that didn't bother me. I was having fun. After a while, I became tired and got out of the water. My dad called me to have lunch together. He brought some packed lunch with him. When I walked out of the water, I saw a woman walking on rocks at the other end of the beach. I don't remember what she was wearing, only that she was a woman. But when I blinked, she disappeared. I didn't think much of it, since I was still a kid. My dad and I had lunch together on the empty steps. When we were finished, he went back to the car to fetch my bottled water, while I waited on the steps. I was watching the beach when I saw a kid, probably the same age as me, 6 or 7 years old, walking at the beach towards a concrete that protruded towards the sea. He walked on it to the end. My dad called me to ask something about the drink, so I turned my head and answered him. When I looked back at the beach, the kid was gone. My dad came back with my drinks, and after I finished my break, I went back to the beach. This time I jumped into the water next to the concrete where the kid was. I played in the water and found some nice shells, so I started to collect them. Some are pretty, so I kept them. I found a weird looking shell. It was long and whitish. I've seen that before. Not pretty, so I threw it back into the sea and kept looking for more shells. This time, I found a really weird looking shell, so I picked it up from the bottom of the shallow sea and inspected it. It was also whitish, a hump with 5 long bony tails. Then I realised it was a hand bone. It was as big as my hand. I screamed and threw it away. I ran out of the water and towards my dad in fear. My dad asked me what happened, and I just cried and told him I found a bone and pointed towards the concrete. He didn't check it out. Instead, he took me back to the car, and we went home. I'm slightly shaken up by this. It's 4 a.m, and the events that happened oddly took place at 3. I'd woken up at 2 from a rather peaceful sleep. No dream, nothing out of the ordinary. I went to go check on my parents, as my mother just had surgery, and I wanted to see if she was doing okay. When I entered my parents' room, I was confused to see just my mother and my sister. Turns out my father went to drive my grandpa to work. I was told his car keys just sort of disappeared, which sucks, because not only do we not have the money to drive there due to the current gas prices, but also due to the fact that if my dad hadn't come back when he did, I might not be typing this right now. My grandfather usually leaves the house for work at around 12 to 3 a.m. He works at the local casino, so he goes early to check over the camera footage and get his daily workout in. My family isn't the most fit, but we're all relatively strong. I believe I woke up right around when they were leaving, because I heard the door and my dog Mia bark outside. She got to go on a long car ride. She goes berserk wherever we take her out on a walk or a car ride. Yeah, that's beside the point. I guess I should point out that I am a minor, and living with my parents and 3 siblings. My oldest sibling I'll call Joseph, J. Not his actual name, but the best I could come up with for the time. I'll refer to myself as Alfred, A. Not my actual name, but it'll work. My other brother wasn't present, so he won't get a nickname. My younger sister we'll call Lil, L. Dad, I'll just refer to as Dad. Those are just all who were there. Though it was just me and Jay that really witnessed it all, Elle was there. She's just too young to really understand. Set the scene, I just finished talking to my mother about my father, taking my grandfather to work. I was walking down the stairs and I thought I saw something move outside the window at the bottom of the stairs before the turn to get downstairs. I was tired and was just going to the bathroom. Jay pops out of the shadows and scares the hell out of me. I was able to do my business and get out quickly to find Jay was making a pot of tea. I was awake enough, so I guess I just said fuck it and logged onto the PS4. Jay had been a bit off, but I didn't really care or worry. Jay's always been a bit off in his own slightly depressing world, but that's okay. It's just something Jay has done for our entire lives. Jay and I both suffer from PTSD due to certain traumas we went through when little. Mine was getting bad, and I could tell Jay's was too. So I guess this could have all been a trick or an illusion cast by our brains. But it would be odd, because we both saw and heard it. I was making a character from my current favourite game on The Sims, of which I'm listening to the outro of right now, which has helped calm me down a lot. We were really invested in getting the design right. That it took me seriously off guard when Jay got really silent out of nowhere. He asked me, hey, the fuck's going on in the window? I looked over, and there was movement, like an animal or a plant, but much more human. I thought it was just windy and one of our plants or vines had come off and was getting flustered around. Dad and the dog had gotten back around this time and went upstairs to go to bed. We didn't think anything of it and just moved on to our tea and Sims, until our mom called us. She told us to make popcorn for my sister because she didn't like the dinner I had cooked earlier. After a little bit of bickering and us just wanting to play games, my sister Elle came down and started yelling at us for not wanting to make a some. Jay eventually got tired of it and made us some, though we burnt the shit out of it. I don't plan on telling him, but after he left I heard some gurgling noises come from outside. It frightened me, but our anxiety was high enough at that point, and I didn't want to freak him out more. Jay eventually came back with an absolutely burnt bag of popcorn. It looked like it had been caught on fire, and smelled like it too. Hell, there was literal smoke coming from the bag. He went to take it outside, but the minute he opened the door, he screamed. I've never heard Jay scream of fear before. It was terrifying. He quickly slammed the door shut and locked it. Jay walked back into the main room with me and Elle, those seconds after the door opened up again. It was locked. I heard him lock it, and I trust when he said it had locked. He went back over to close it again and relock it. I heard him saying something to stay back, stay the fuck back. At that point, Elle had started crying, so I asked her to go to the kitchen and grab a knife for me, in case anything were to happen, and to run upstairs and alert Dad. She did. She was asked, and then immediately went upstairs and got our father. Jay was still threatening the thing behind the door, but I could tell he was terrified. Hearing my dad load and ready his gun while practically running down the stairs sent terror, yet a feeling of safety rushed through my body. Dad checked it out, but whatever it was had left. He locked the front door again and helped me lock the back door. Normally I'd hunt on some property that my family owns. I don't even remember the reason anymore that I decided to hunt on public land this time. Probably just a change of scenery. I remember that it was evening and fall, but it was a fairly uncharacteristically warm day. I got to the access road and pulled off the spot where everyone pulls off to park and walk in. I noticed there were a couple of old boys already there. Nothing too weird about them, except there's no truck or vehicle for them to have pulled in on. They also didn't have guns with them, but were dressed in hunter orange. But at the time, I just figured that they were backpackers or campers. They're not too far from this spot, and a campground, and it's not uncommon for folks to spend weekends away from their family for some peace and quiet for their hunting trip. Anyways, they seemed friendly enough, and there was absolutely nothing said to make them seem any different than hundreds of other fellows I've met hunting. They were just a couple of hillbillies from the sounds of it. We shot the shit for a couple of minutes. They took off, and I sat on my phone for a bit trying to give them a head start, because I was afraid they'd drive off the squirrels. Except, I clearly didn't wait long enough. Probably like 10 minutes up the trail, it curved to the left, but I heard noises coming directly from ahead. It sounded bigger than a squirrel, but I also like seeing any sort of animal, and it didn't sound too far off the main path. When I crept off the path and the ground started to drop, so I was able to look down and see my new pals, but not acting right at all. This is going to be hard to explain without a visual, but they just weren't moving like normal people. Their movements were jerky, and it's almost like they've forgotten that things like knees and other joints were able to bend. I didn't stick around long, because frankly it was fucking terrifying. I backed away slowly and quietly to the trail, and then hauled ass back to my car. I've spoken with several of the more open-minded outdoorsmen in the area, and none of them have ever heard of anything like that. Drugs were the most common theory that I've heard, and I know that's the logical assumption, but man, I've seen folks on a lot of different drugs, and those movements just look too scarily unnatural. I've done some Googling in the years since for similar incidents in my area, but have yet to find anything that sounds like it. The one that stuck to me was something that happened about 3 years ago. To this day, it feels unreal, but I know it happened. I went straight to my nana and told her. I was about to move out to a bigger city, but emotionally I was defeated. I was suicidal and ready to give up. I was determined to end my life and was ready to do it within the week. I was sitting in my room crying my eyes out, like sobbing very, very hard. I don't even know how else to explain how defeated I felt and sad. It was bad. Anyway, I was sitting on my bed, somewhat facing the wall to my right. About an hour into whatever that was I was going through, I felt the most loving, warm, and just supportive and full of love hug I've ever felt. It's as if someone hugged me from the back and held on tight. I felt so much love in that moment, and it felt warm, like an actual hug. I was so shocked. It snapped me out of my sadness, and not 1 minute later, I started to feel better and a lot calmer. The thoughts I had were gone. All I could concentrate on was the feeling that was wrapped around me. It lasted about 10 seconds. I'm not sure how long, to be honest. To this day, I don't know what or who that was, but it's something I think about when I feel like I'm not being watched over or I'm not emotionally feeling my best. I remind myself that I am in fact worthy of being here. I have many more stories, but this one is definitely the one that I think about often. Ever since I was around 4, I've seen things that shouldn't be there. Locked doors have cracked open themselves, light switches have turned off, and personal items have been knocked off shelves. Shadow figures have ran across my ceilings and attempted to hide in the corners of my room. I've woken up with long, claw-like scratch marks on my arms. The marks were deep and almost bleeding. My father swore that they might scar, as my mother assured me that I must have scratched myself in my sleep. I stared down at my fingernails that I had bitten down to the nubs while I nodded. My brother joked and said it must have been Freddy Krueger. In fear of being another victim of Freddy, I retreated to my parents' bedroom floor. I camped out with a stuffed animal in tow. My dog laid at my feet as the glow of my parents' TV brought me comfort. My dad's snores filled the room, and I was at ease that nothing could possibly harm me. Once my mother decided it was time for bed, I was swallowed up into the darkness. I heard a faint good night, but I could swear I heard the stairs creaking. I laid on my side and my eyes adjusted to the darkness. I was staring into the underneath of my parents' bed. I felt uneasy, so I turned to lie on my other side and made sure to fix my ponytail. I began drifting to sleep until I felt a harsh coldness on my neck. Something yanked my ponytail as hard as it could. I was fed up and whipped my head around to face the culprit. I yelled, "Stop it!" into the darkness that I no longer feared. I tightened my ponytail and turned back around to sleep. That and many more things took place between the ages of 4 to 9. After the night I shouted at whatever it was to stop it, I was no longer bothered, until now. I think whatever it is, it's mad that we're moving. The basement has become the place I'm uncomfortable going down alone in. The door has kept opening by itself, to the point where my dad installed a new lock. They keep mentioning that it's an old house, which is why we're selling. I've told them my stories, but only my mom believes due to her own experiences. About a week ago, my parents were boxing things up in the basement and carrying them outside to the front yard through the basement door that leads out onto the yard. My dad's friend was stopping by with his truck to load it up and take it up to the new house. My mom left her phone in the kitchen, and the wife of my dad's friend ended up calling her. I looked out into the yard, but didn't see either of my parents. I called down the basement stairs to my mom, and it was quiet for a minute. "Yeah?" my mother called back. I quickly shouted back that the phone was for her. "Okay, bring me the phone," she said back. I asked the wife to hold on for just one more moment as I rushed down the stairs. I found myself standing alone in the basement. I looked around and looked into the dark windows of my dad's workshop. I called my mum again and didn't receive a response. I swallowed the lump in my throat and advanced towards my dad's workshop. I figured she must have gone out the basement door into the yard. I made it to the basement door and I froze as I reached for the knob. The door was locked and there was no way my mom was ever able to be down there. The room was cold and I pressed her phone back to my ear to tell the wife that my mom could have just have to call her back. Except there was no longer a phone call. I never heard the call end or even fail. I looked at my mom's recent calls and I didn't see the wife's name. Realization hit me and I ran as fast as I could back upstairs. The basement light was no longer on and I swear I wasn't alone down there. I slammed the door and locked it. I rushed to the front door and saw both of my parents outside. After yanking the door open, I began shouting and asking where my mother had been. They looked at me weirdly and stated they had been out there the entire time. I shook my head and explained what had happened. My mom paled before telling me that her and my dad heard something while in the basement too. My dad told me to follow him as he led me to the basement door. He unlocked it and showed me a hole in the wall. The wind had apparently blown the door open too hard and caused it to slam into the wall. But when my parents looked at the damage, they noticed something was inside the wall. My dad pulled out 2 photographs. Both photographs were in black and white and of 2 little girls. One looked 2 and the other looked to be at least 5. Neither of them was smiling and the 5-year-old looked almost angry. I yelled at my dad to put it the hell back or burn it. He ended up putting it back into the wall. Later that night, we noticed lots of flies in the house. I assumed a skunk or a possum might have passed, so I ventured outside to find the source. I ended up finding a dead black kitten underneath the house, and I can't help but feel that it's somehow connected. I've been waking with bruises and seeing more shadow figures in the corner of my ceiling. My parents have been dealing with their bedroom door being thrown open, and my dad swears that he is laughing at 3 a.m, which is when he wakes up now. My biggest fear is that whatever this thing is, it will somehow follow us to our next house. I'm sick of dealing with this and being afraid of this thing abusing me in my sleep some more. It was probably around midnight when I was laying on my bed reading my book. I have a window on the wall I was facing, and I left it slightly open with the shade up because my cat was sitting there looking outside. All I had was a lamp that hung on my bed frame. So I'm reading my book, and out of the corner of my eye, I see a very bright tennis ball-sized light out the window, doing a very fast, unnatural, rounded zigzag movement. This lasted a couple seconds and disappeared behind my wall. I immediately thought I was having an issue with one of my eyes, causing me to see a light, like a retinal detachment or something. But that seemed absurd since I'm in my early 20s. Then I noticed my cat on the windowsill, immobile, staring towards where the light disappeared behind her. I called her name, and she didn't even twitch her ear to show that she heard, like she usually does. That's when I thought, okay, so I'm not the only one who saw it. My cat did too, and she was definitely spooked. I spoke to my mum about it immediately, as she was still awake and I was terrified. While I'm more of a curious skeptic when it comes to the paranormal, she's a believer and has experienced things she couldn't explain many years ago. At first she wondered if it were a drone, but I'd never seen a drone move that fast in that kind of movement before. Also, I didn't hear a single sound when it happened, and to my limited knowledge about drones, there's usually a sound. Then my mum thought about another, more paranormal possibility that I'm not sure about, but want to share anyways. There's a moderately busy highway just across the field from my house. My house is alone in the field, out in the open, and you can clearly see it from the highway. There was a major accident on the highway that night, a few hours before I saw the light. It was such a bad accident that the affected portion of the highway was blocked off for hours by a dozen police and firemen. That I'm aware of, at least one person died. My mum thought perhaps I saw an orb, which could be the spirit of that driver who was lost and didn't understand what had happened. Again, I tend towards being a skeptic. However, I don't have any rational explanation for what I saw, and it honestly scared me. Has anyone experienced this before, or know what it could have been?